Well, hello, brothers and sisters. I am so glad that you're here with me today. This show is, of course, called Readings with Regina. I am Regina. I'm actually Dr. Regina Jennings, and I am doing this video series because I want to raise the intellectual level of my people. And reading and being read to automatically raises the intellectual level of those who are listening. And this is what I absolutely want to do for my people who are a people who had to fight to learn how to read centuries ago. In fact, it was a law pervasive in America that Black people, we were called Negro then, we were enslaved then. It was a law against learning how to read. So if you want any more immediate information on that, you should read the narrative of Frederick Douglass because he tells you in narrative form and great detail what he went through to learn how to read. And I have noticed that in the 21st century, because of technology, a lot of my people are not reading sufficiently. So again, this is why I created this video series. And I want to remind you all that reading literally makes connections, neural connections within the brain. And the more connections that you make within your brain, the smarter you will be. And this is what we need. In the 1960s, we used to say nation time, and we meant that. So, what does it mean to build a nation? It means to know the infrastructure of how a nation operates. And this is one of the reasons that I have chosen this remarkable book called Murder Incorporated, Empire, Genocide, and Manifest Destiny. And it is by Mumia Abu Jamal and Stephen Victoria. It is a book that takes you from the beginning of America right on into the contemporary times in which we are living. And check this out. If you listened to President Donald Trump's inaugural address the other day, do you know he mentioned American exceptionalism? American exceptionalism, which I have been highlighting in my readings. He also mentioned manifest destiny, which has also been mentioned in these readings. So it's important to lay a foundation for all of us to understand our beginnings so that we can prepare for our future. And I encourage all of you, if you have children, have them look at this series. It doesn't matter if they don't want to. Be a parent, have them look at this series, especially if they're age appropriate. When you all sit down for a meal, talk about what was going on in this series and also talk about what is going on in this country. This is how you raise the intellectual level of your children. And check this out. If you don't have children, go get some. Get some from family members. Or even better, go to a foster care unit and become a foster care parent. When you are involved with a foster care child, you can set the terms as to when you go, so your time can be scheduled. But let me assure you, should you take on a foster child or two, that will make such a difference in that Black child's life. He or she will look so forward to your visits. And you can plan activities that will enhance both of you, or even just being with a child who is separated from his or her parents will mean so much. And like Dr. Frances Cress Welsing has said, our children need more nurturing. They need more lap time. They need more care, and they need more attention. So do think about what I'm saying here right now, because I absolutely want to affect the greatest positive change possible for my people. So I'm going to get right into this book. Again, Murder Incorporated, Empire, Genocide, and Manifest Destiny. And I'm going to repeat one more time because it blew my mind listening to President Trump in his inaugural address mention American exceptionalism, which I've talked about throughout this series, and manifest destiny. Okay, for those of you who are following along with me, I am on page 50, and the subtitle is Capitalism and Slavery. Between Columbus's arrival and the end of the United States Civil War, nearly 12 million slaves were viciously ripped from their homeland and transported to the Americas, with approximately 1/2 million arriving in the United States, leaving almost 11 million landing south of the United States border. The dead, and there were countless souls lost on these murderous voyages along the Middle Passage, were not counted, but rather tossed overboard. In fact, many Africans who suffered from disease or were driven insane by deplorable and shocking conditions were either thrown overboard, alive, or first clubbed to death and then thrown overboard. It is against this backdrop of a macabre and low-down slave trade, along with wanton murder, that the European powers and the British Empire fueled and maintained their vaunted industrial revolution, moving dramatically from mercantilism to the corporate god of capitalism. It is no wonder that Karl Marx writes in Capital of European capitalism rising out of the, quote, bloody womb, end of quote, of American slavery. Looking back over Marx's influential work as a philosopher, economist, and historian, it becomes clear that he identified the enslavement of Africans in America as an essential force behind mounting capitalism, not only in the New World, but in Europe as well. In the late 1840s, Marx wrote a prescient observation regarding American slavery as it relates to the American empire's financial wherewithal. Quote, direct slavery is just as much the pivot of bourgeoisie industry as machinery, credits, etc. Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that has given the colonies their value. It is the colonies that have created world trade. And it is world trade that is the precondition of large scale industry. Thus, slavery is an economic category of the greatest importance. In 1944, Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, I highly recommend that book, challenged the secure, mythical tenets of European and American history. Williams, who later became the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, makes a powerful case that the African slave trade propelled Europe's rise to global economic dominance, and that the massive profits from the triangular slave trade, Europe to Africa to the Americas and back again, helped to finance and bolster the Industrial Revolution. Williams contends that the occupation and subsequent takeover of the so called New World was reliant upon the enslavement and exploitation of the African slaves held captive in the Americas. Williams examines this economic history by focusing on the British slave trade with the West Indies. The triangular trade thereby gave a triple stimulus to British industry. The profits obtained provided one of the main streams of that accumulation of capital in England, which financed the Industrial Revolution. Sir Joshua Child estimated that every Englishman in the West Indies, with the 10 blacks that work with him, accounting what they eat, use, and wear, would make employment for 4 men in England. By Devenant's computation, one person in the islands, white or Negro, was as profitable as 7 in England. England was by far the dominant force in the triangular slave trade throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. A powerful navy, coupled with seemingly unlimited capital, enabled the British to flourish when it came to human trafficking, although the French, Portuguese, Dutch, and Americans were vigorous competitors. Among many others, Karl Marx suggests that all capitalist societies in their formative years require, quote, the primitive accumulation of capital, end of quote. The slave trade provided a motherlode of this necessary early wealth to help launch the French, the Dutch, and British capitalist models. The triangular slave trade refers to the approximate shape of the shipping routes and who built the ships, the shipping routes on a map of the Atlantic. The first stage involved transporting goods from Europe to Africa to expand colonial empires and acquire more slaves. The second stage, or the Middle Passage, was the export of slaves to the Americas, and the third stage was the return of the fruits of slave labor to Europe, primarily cotton, tobacco, sugar, molasses, and rum. This sadistic cycle worked like a charm for the booming economies of Europe and later America. For instance, prior to the US Civil War, one crop, slave grown cotton, provided more than 50% of all American export earnings. 50%. In fact, for decades, American slaves cultivated more than 60% of the world's cotton. This major windfall in the textile industry laid the foundation for America's vast economic growth throughout the 19th century for 200 years. American historians and propagandists have conveniently tried to frame slavery as pre-capitalist, when in fact, this horrific chapter in Europe and America's history is inherent to wealth building in the modern era. At the time and to this day, there were widely held claims that the collapse of slavery in the West Indies was brought about by British humanitarianism. Williams dismisses this claim, arguing that abolition was driven instead by the changing financial conditions and new economic demands that arose as the British Empire transitioned from mercantile model to a capitalist system. Williams reasons that it was only after slavery became an economic hindrance that abolitionists in Europe and then in the United States actually succeeded in curbing the slave trade. And finally, abolishing slavery, historian, journalist, and social theorist C.L.R. James, whose seminal work on the African diaspora, the Black Jacobins, greatly influenced Eric Williams. Like any good investigative journalist, ask the hard and necessary questions. What turned the tide on the British slave trade? Was it the intellectual and moral climate of the Enlightenment? That's what they call that particular age. Or was it the changing economic climate? James passionately concludes the loss of the slave holding American colonies took much cotton out of the ears of the British bourgeoisie. Adam Smith and Arthur Young, heralds of the Industrial Revolution and wage slavery, were already preaching against the waste of chattel slavery. Deaf up to 1783, the British bourgeoisie now heard and looked again at the West Indies. Their own colonies were bankrupt. They were losing the slave trade to the French and to the British. See, this was always a competition among European powers. Slavery could then take away jobs from wage earners in Europe. Why should they continue to do this? In 3 years, the first abolitionist society was formed, and the British Prime Minister began to clamor for the abolition of slavery, for the sake of humanity, no doubt, but also, as it was well understood, to ruin French economy. You see, they were rivals for economic growth and development. So then slavery was somewhat like a football they could just toss around at the expense and the horror of those who were enslaved. James argues that there were two central reasons. First, that despite the theatrics in Britain's parliament about the immorality of slavery, which it was the economic pressure that brought about their sudden change of heart. But there was another, even more responsible historic groundswell that forced the captor's hand, and that was the actual resistance and rebellions of the Africans themselves. One of the great myths perpetrated on the world in general, and the American people in particular, is that of the submissive and obedient African slave. C.L.R. James dispels this lie. Quote, "The Negro's revolutionary history is rich, inspiring, and unknown. Negroes revolted against the slave raiders in Africa. They revolted against the slave traders on the Atlantic Passage. They revolted on the plantations. The docile Negro is a myth." Myth indeed, for we only need to investigate the names Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, good old Harriet Tubman, Toussaint Louverture, and a Missouri slave named Celia, who was executed by the state for fighting back against a master for his ongoing penchant for rape. I also want to add to that list an enslaved brother called Madison Washington. Look him up. His story is miraculous. Madison Washington, an enslaved African. Okay, I'm going to jump now to page 55, and I'm going to pick up where it is called Warmed by the Aryan Sun. The excuse me, the megalomaniacal spirit that infused the march of Anglo-Saxon civilization saturated colonial America. The fledgling republic, its institutions, as well as the general public, were steeped in and exhilarated by the ongoing occupation and expanding settlement. We're talking about the Americas now. Andrew Barnaby, a British clergyman, wrote about his travels through America during the colonial period and experienced early American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism. Firsthand, an idea, strange as it is visionary, has entered into the minds of the generality of mankind that empire, that's the Americas now, empire is traveling westward, and everyone is looking forward with eager and impatient expectation to that destined moment when America is to give law to the rest of the world. Barnaby keenly identified the spirit of American exceptionalism that was alive and well in America. As historian James Bradley writes, Thomas Jefferson, who persuaded the trustees of the University of Virginia to offer the nation's first course in the Anglo-Saxon language, justified colonial America's breaking its ties with Mother England as a return to a better time when his Aryan, you should look that up, Aryan ancestors had lived in liberty. Bradley continues his excavation of Jefferson's imagined Aryan roots. Quote, in 1774, he wrote a summary view of the rights of British America, a series of complaints against King George, which foreshadowed by 2 years his 1776 Declaration of Independence. Jefferson refers to God twice, but invokes England's Saxon ancestors 6 times in calling for a freer hand from the king. Jefferson writes of their shared, quote, Saxon ancestors who had left their native wilds and woods in the north of Europe, had taken the island of Britain, and had established there that system of laws which has so long been the glory and protection of that country, end of quote. Jefferson argued that since the original Saxons were ruled by, quote, no superior and were not subject to feudal conditions, end of quote, the king should lighten his hold on his American colonies. Bradley concludes that Jefferson envisioned a new country warmed by the Aryan sun. Jefferson postulates the rock-solid foundation of Anglo-Saxon rule and tradition. Quote, has not every restitution of the ancient Saxon laws had happy effects? Is it not better now that we return at once into that happy system of our ancestors, the wisest and most perfect ever yet, devised by the wit of man as it stood before the 8th century? On the 4th of July, 1776, the Continental Congress asked Franklin, Ben, and Jefferson to suggest images to grace the Great Seal of the United States. Let's harken back to our earlier example of Jefferson's penchant for mythic pomposity when he invoked the biblical Israelites. This time, Tom goes straight to his passion for Anglo-Saxonism and spitballs this gem about two tough Teuton brothers. Look that up, Teuton, Teuton, brothers named Hanks and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descendant and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. As the 19th century continued, American exceptionalism and its Aryan Anglo-Saxon roots were evolving and maturing, a perfect rationale and rallying cry for the predetermined march to the Pacific, even if it meant the murder, Lord have mercy, and removal of those, quote, merciless savages Jefferson wrote so eloquently about in his declaration 30 years before. At its base, Manifest Destiny provided the necessary rationalization for manipulation, greed, selfishness, and violence, really murder. In his 1850 novel, White Jacket, American novelist Herman Melville drank a healthy dose of 19th century Manifest Destiny, flavored Kool-Aid, and presented the case for America's infallibility. By the way, Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, but that's another issue. This is what Melville wrote in his novel, White Jacket. And we Americans are the peculiar, chosen people, the Israel of our time. We bear the ark of the liberties of the world. 70 years ago, we escaped from thrall, and besides our first birthright, embracing one continent of earth, God has given it to us. For a future inheritance, the broad domains of the political pagans that shall yet come and lie down under the shade of our ark, without bloody hands being lifted. God has predestinated mankind, expects great things from our race, and great things we feel in our soul. The rest of the nations must soon be in our rear. We are the pioneers of the world, the advance guard sent on through the wilderness of untried things to break a new path in the new world that is ours. In our youth is our strength, in our inexperience, our wisdom. At a period when other nations have but lisped, our deep voice is heard afar. Long enough have we been skeptics with regard to ourselves and doubted whether indeed the political Messiah has come. But he has. The political Messiah has come in us. If we would but give utterance to his promptings, and let us always remember that with ourselves, almost for the first time in the history of the earth, a national selfishness is unbounded philanthropy. Lord have mercy. For we cannot do a good to America, but we give alms to the world. So you see, the actual making of America was mythologized. Understand that, people. You who worked for free for centuries aren't even mentioned. Okay? The Europeans just came here, those fabulous Anglo Saxons, they just came here and did everything because God blessed them. They are the chosen people of the Bible. I'm going to read just a little more. In mid-century, just about the time John L. O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny in an 1845 issue of the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, physician Joshua Knott and Egyptologist George Gideon wrote Types of Mankind. So science is going to follow the mythology of being the chosen people. White American science is going to buttress that mythological idea that has been implanted on the people. Types of Mankind, a textbook that used science to support a hierarchy of races and the suppression of Blacks through slavery. This 19th century bestseller would focus its science on Native Americans, boasting that, quote, he can no more be civilized than a leopard can change his spots, end of quote. Not the proud owner of 9 African slaves would rather declare that the Negro achieves his greatest perfection, and Negro is written with a small n, physical and moral, and also his greatest longevity in a state of slavery. And then, just for kicks, let's tune into the father of American anthropology, one Lewis Henry Morgan, who adapted Darwinian theory during the 19th century to conclude that the various races were in different stages of physical and cultural evolution. Quote, for Gilded Age American anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan, the Black man was inferior to the white and was falling behind every year, end of quote. Morgan named the 3 types of human cultural achievement: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. Morgan, who was president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, went on to speculate that the Aryan family represents the central stream of human progress. I'm going to stop here, brothers and sisters, because I want you to understand the foundation in the making of America, where these historians and writers and those who lived during those time periods would never acknowledge slavery. They just erased it, you see, like it didn't exist. They would never acknowledge the red nations, the millions of red nations that were here. They just genocided the red nations, enslaved and partially killed numerous Africans, men, women, and children. And they act as if this system under which we live just developed out of their genius. And I even want to mention a person that was mentioned that, let me see, I can't find it, that was mentioned at the inaugural address, a President William McKinley. Let me see if I can find this book. Because William McKinley owned slaves. Because that's never mentioned. Never mentioned. But he was a president who owned slaves. and he was a businessman. So I just wanted to share that with you because I'm combining our moment in time with the moments in time, the previous ones that I have read to you today. So, in closing, I absolutely want to thank you all for being here. I so appreciate you and the support. And again, I encourage you to share this video with other people, particularly in your family or those even not in your family, and also to children. Do not let the youngsters that you are around just grow up in this media age and this television age. Do not do that because the media that is mostly presented to you is, in fact, quite unhealthy. So, brothers and sisters, I love you dearly, and I look forward to hanging out with you again this Thursday at 2 o'clock. Peace.